Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Lifting the Lid on Work and Cancer. It's fantastic to have everyone joining in person and online. My name's Jemima Reynolds. I'm the head of programs for Trekstock. And Trekstock is all about bringing people together to talk about the topics that matter to them, to empower and equip them and inform them so that they can have better conversations with the people in their communities, families, friends, and of course their oncology teams. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our fantastic panel. We brought in the best experts we know to be having this conversation to ensure that more of you understand your rights when it comes to work. So we have Génevie, who working with cancer. She has a master's in law with emphasis on employment law. She was herself diagnosed with breast cancer in 2009 and again in 2014. Thanks for joining us, Génevie. We have Temi, who's a cancer support specialist at Maggie's Royal Free, offering one-to-one advice and support in the form of support groups, workshops, and courses for anyone that's been affected by cancer. We've also done some fantastic events with Maggie's in the past called Meet and Moves. We also have Paul, who is an executive coach who works with those facing change, uncertainty, and challenge. He was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia in his early 30s and chose to combine his organizational and personal experience of working for one of the big four in challenge and uncertainty. And we also have Nicola, who is 33 and one of the Trekstock community, who was diagnosed with endometrial cancer at 30. She is passionate about sharing her story of being diagnosed and supported by her workplace, as her mum was diagnosed with kidney cancer at 35 and lost her job as a result. Welcome, Nicola. Thank you for joining. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So to start with, I want to quote some stats from some research that was carried out by Working with Cancer in 2022, where it was found 57% said that when returning to work, they knew they were that only 50% knew that they were legally disabled under the 2010 Equality Act. Only 22% said their HR departments told their employees about their right to ask for reasonable adjustments and a phased return to work. So this is a really important conversation to be having, not only because work is such an important part of our life and our identity, but also for the fact that we've gone through 2 years of hell and having to cope with returning to work after restrictions and the expectations of employers when it comes to returning to work and ensuring that their employees are safe. So I'm going to start by having a chat with Génevie. So you've been working with cancer. What's the most common things you hear about when it comes to being diagnosed with cancer and coping with telling your employer?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. A lot of people that phone in will often say that, first of all, their HR department and or their employer is not aware of their legal rights. A lot of companies don't have a cancer policy, which I'd encourage everyone to really look into. So there is a framework in order for them to discuss cancer with their employees when they come to them. So I think that's really, not a lot of employees know how to approach their employer, what to say, what their rights are for going off and having treatment, or what happens next. I now have cancer, what do I have to tell you? When do I have to tell you? And how am I going to be covered financially? So I think these are all important discussions, and a framework really needs to be set up in an organization where you can answer those systematically, and also that the employer can maybe go to the policy, have a look at it, and that they can then have those meaningful discussions with their employer.
Fantastic, thank you. And Temi, some of the community of Trekstock tell us that they want to continue working. Do you hear that much?
Yes, I think, like you say, because it is such a big part of people's identity, the routine of work, and also sort of the certainty of work, there's a big desire to want to continue doing that. I think I find that there's a low percentage that are actually able to, just because of treatment or different things that are coming up after having a diagnosis. And so it's really sort of trying to work out what do I do next then in regards to that. How do I have these conversations? How do I find out information about what I can or can't continue?
So it's managing expectations of yourself and your employer. Nicola, what was your experience like when you were diagnosed with cancer? How did you go about telling your employer?
Well, I was told over the phone, so I got diagnosed over the phone, and I did exactly the same thing. I just rang my employer, and had a conversation with them on the phone, which probably wasn't the best way to do it, but it seemed logical at the time. But yeah, they have been brilliant, kind of all the way through. But yeah, in hindsight, I don't think that's the way that I would have done it.
And in terms of, so you're a teacher, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah.
So obviously, are you a primary school teacher or a secondary school?
No, so I work at a college and I'm a course leader. I'm so sorry. That's probably why I can't talk.
You're a course leader. And how did you tell the people that you support and teach?
Yeah, so if I'm honest, I think that was probably the hardest thing. And I had lots of conversations with my manager, and I didn't tell them at first. So they didn't know because I guess I didn't really want to be seen as someone different, if that makes any sense at all. And it's only, I mean, I'm 3 years kind of post-operation, and it's only really this year that I've actually told the students. So the students that I knew at the time didn't know, they just knew that I was unwell. And I still see some of those students now, but it took me a long time, I think, to be able to tell them.
It's such a hard thing to come to terms with yourself, let alone having to tell others, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience. I'm going to come to your mum's experience in a minute.
Okay.
Paul, what about you? What was when you were diagnosed with leukemia and you were working at one of the big four? How did you go about telling your employer?
So mine was also on the phone. So I was diagnosed in the hospital, and I remember saying, and it was and it was a shock. I'd only been off work for a couple of days with a toothache, and I said, let me go home, have a cup of tea. I think it's a very English response. Have a cup of tea, relax, and then I'll come back in and start treatment. And the doctor said, we can't let you leave the ward because your immune system is already really low. So I couldn't go anywhere. I chose to make 2 calls. The first call was to a very good friend, and I said, I need you to tell my friendship group. And then I picked one leader at work that I really trusted. And I called him, and I explained the situation. I said, can you do me a favor, and can you find out whatever it is that needs to happen and make it happen? I don't want to receive lots of different calls from different people at work. But I'm happy for everyone to know why I'm not there. And on the back of that, I know that things happen in the background, and I didn't. So I just made the one call to someone I really trusted and found that really helpful.
I mean, that's an incredible advice, isn't it, in terms of having to tell people over and over again. Is it a legal obligation to have to tell your colleagues?
No, not at all. It's absolutely personal. I chose not to tell my colleagues when I was diagnosed. I only spoke to my line manager at the time. Obviously, because we're employment lawyers, we all knew what the procedure was. But even so, it's completely personal. The only person you have an obligation to tell eventually, and I say eventually because it's not even an obligation when you first find out, you might want to not tell your employer until you know exactly what your treatment schedule is going to be so you can have that meaningful discussion. But it's absolutely up to you who you tell, what information is dispelled to the rest of your colleagues. And I think you should be really clear about that. Like Paul was, he was happy to tell his colleagues and have them kind of give him the support that he needed. A lot of people don't. They're very private and they want to go through that in a private manner. Another thing I want to touch on just quickly is also be really clear with your employer about the contact that you want with your employer. Do you want them to phone you and say, hey, how are you doing every month? A lot of people want that. They want that to feel connected to the employer. They feel if the employer is not doing that, then they don't care about them, or they don't really want them in the organization, or they are different. So really be clear with your employer. I wouldn't mind if you kind of picked up the phone or Zoomed or whatever and find out how I'm doing. Or is it okay if I contact you once my procedure or my treatment plan has run its course, and then we'll talk about going back to work. So it really is personal, and I think each person who goes through cancer does it in your own unique manner. But I think the organizations must be alive to that and be malleable, be changeable. No two people in your organization are going to feel the same way and want the same treatment.
I think that is such an important point to recognise that people are different.
Yeah.
No two people go through cancer the same. No people
Absolutely.
respond to anything the
Yeah.
same. So, Temi, is there
Can
anything?
I add to that?
You may.
So I also experienced that during my treatment, which was over a period of more than a year, my want changed from
Right.
my
Absolutely.
employer, from
Yeah.
my colleagues. So I went from not wanting much contact to actually, I do remember saying I'd love emails and cards.
Sure.
So don't call me, but I'd love emails and cards. And then I was flooded with them, and it was really helpful. And I didn't want that at first, but then
Yeah.
I shifted. And I think it's okay to change your mind. when you're going
100%.
through it.
It's that communication, isn't it, between yourself and your employer, and keeping that open,
Yeah.
because does change,
Yeah.
depending on how you respond to your treatment,
Yeah.
how you mentally respond to cancer and what you're going through. So absolutely right to change your mind halfway through.
Temi, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's just, being flexible, and I don't know if there are employers watching, but actually just keeping that conversation and that discussion
Yeah.
flexible, so that your employees feel like they're comfortable, and they're confident in their ability to request that and to say, actually, I have changed my mind, or I would prefer if we change how we do things. And I think it's just, really important to keep that communication flexible.
Definitely.
And I think also, what about the practical? So you said you were in hospital and you couldn't go back. You wanted to have a cup of tea, come to terms with what was going on. But what about handover, outstanding tasks, projects, people you had to, stakeholders you had to speak to? How was it communicated to the wider, those people you had relationship holders with?
So I felt super lucky that my desk, my laptop, all of my projects were organised in the way they were supposed to be, because during my career that hadn't always been the case.
Well done, Paul.
And thanks, pat myself on the back. But at that point, I'd taken what was, I thought, a couple of days off, and then I didn't reappear into the working environment for over 18 months.
Wow.
So I left it with the leader that I spoke about, which is you need to manage the conversations with our clients, that I'm not going to be there. You can choose to tell them what or not for the sake of the business. I suppose it was a strange realization, not a single project missed a beat. So the firm I worked at
Wow.
is capable of moving on and looking after itself. So there was a bit of a blow to the ego, turns out.
bit.
Yeah.
But what a powerful release for you don't need to carry all that on your shoulders. That's what leaders are there for.
Now, that is a really important point because you're working for a big corporation.
Yeah.
So, Nicola, you're not working for a big corporation. How was it handled in terms of handover and projects, et cetera, or lesson plans, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not working for a big corporation, but there was 40 young people whose grades depended on me marking and IVing. So I think for me, that was probably the hardest thing because I definitely had a lot of guilt around me not being there and people not doing things and that impacting on the young people. And I guess particularly for me, I had a few emails from parents, which you can't stop, and I completely understood it. But obviously at the time, I was obsessively checking my emails. And I think that's the first thing I'd say. A doctor said to me, the world will go on and you turn those emails off because you have to focus on you. And that was really powerful because I am a workaholic, I think, in a way. And I think like Paul said, the world does go on. And, you know, my managers kind of work together and all of the members of staff club together. I did a few small bits, but kind of got it to the point, I guess, where I felt happy to leave it. And then I just had to switch off because I had huge things to focus on.
Definitely. And it's trusting your employers will pick it up, and also that your colleagues have your best interest at heart. And also, I think, is there anything that you would have done differently, like, apart from not answering all those emails and switching those off? Is there anything that you would have done differently when it came
Do you mean
to
in terms of returning to work?
Oh no,
or-
just when you were diagnosed and telling people.
I think what Genevieve said about having kind of clear conversations about actually what I expected from my employer, that took me, I think, probably about six months to really kind of get my head around that I could say no,
Right.
and I could take the time to really
Yeah.
think. And I think in hindsight, I didn't do that enough. And that's what I would say to everybody going through that journey, is that actually it is a journey, and you are your own advocate, and it's
Yeah.
okay to talk about what you need. Yeah, I think that's my kind of downfall. And people around me kept telling me, take the time, you've got all the time in the world, you really need to think, but I wasn't kind enough to myself. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Temi, I think the really important point is also about what are your the benefits, sick pay, and Genevieve, what are the rights that people have when diagnosed with cancer when it comes to sick pay and other benefits, Temi?
Yes, I think you might actually have more experience in terms of the legal side of sort of sick pay. I think depending on where you work and what your role is, it can be different. So whether you're working for the public sector, private sector.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't know if you want to explain sort of the difference between that, and then I can go and talk about financial support.
I think when it comes to sick pay and the obligation for the employer to pay you while you are off sick, rule of thumb, always look at your contract of employment. Your contract of employment will state if you've got enhanced sick pay. So a lot of big companies or well-established companies will give it enhanced sick pay. So for example, they'll pay you 90% of your pay for a period of time, and then it will graduate down, or there's an insurance policy that will kind of pick it up. A lot of people that work for small organizations will only get government sick pay. Yeah. So that's what we call statutory sick pay, it's SSP. It's a really nominal amount. It's not really worth really much. I mean, you can't really get by, I think, on a weekly basis on it. And I think that's when the stress comes in, isn't it?
Huge.
Not knowing how to pay your weekly, bills, mortgages, whatever the case is. And I think particularly when you're a young individual, maybe you're just starting to want to look at a mortgage, or maybe you've just been able to buy a house and you're diagnosed. So I think take advice. The Citizens Advice Bureau is out there, Macmillan is out there. These organizations really give very good advice. What can I do? How can I top that up? But first of all, go and look at your employment contract, see what your benefits are. Chat to your employer again, speak to your HR, ask them the pointed questions. What happens if I'm off for 6 months? How do I get paid? Very often, a lot of companies will say, well, we'll pay your sick pay and then, we'll top it up with your holiday pay. So definitely have those discussions if you are worried about your financial obligations.
And just to add on to that, what we have in every sort of Maggie's team is a financial advisor and a debt advisor, and they'll just offer free advice and let you know what you're actually entitled to, whether that be just financial support for living costs, travel costs, but even they'll help you with applications if there's grants and there's loans and benefits. There's a variety of support, and so I think it's understanding what the options are and what you're entitled to as well. And if you don't ask, you don't know, and so you don't have to sit in silence and just go through it. There's a lot of support there available.
I mean, having said that, to navigate benefits is so confusing, and I mean the PIP is just so confusing. So Maggie's, Macmillan, all those people out there are on hand to help you make sense of it all.
100%.
I wonder if it's also saying if you struggle to go through your contract or you struggle to go through your policies, if you're comfortable asking a colleague or someone from the organisation to help you go through it, I don't think it's a bad thing. So, and if you're comfortable, then great. But if it, I don't know, some people it scares them reading through a document.
Me.
And when you're in the midst of chemo, your treatment is you might not do your best thinking.
No,
I think that's a really important point. And I think, what if you don't have an HR?
Well, I mean, in an organization, if you don't have an actual human resources department, it would be your line manager, your supervisors, whoever is in charge of you. It could be the owner directly. I think everybody has that relationship. There is going to be someone that you report to. And some people have really good relationships with their employers. So I think don't be scared to have that conversation. And I just want to touch on what Nicola said. She said she had the guilt of going off. I think that's true for everybody. You do have that guilt. What do I do now? Who's going to look after my cases? Who's going to look after my clients? Again, it's so individual, isn't it? A lot of people need to actually keep working in order to keep their mental state up, and they actually actively want to do that. But again, have that discussion. I think I want to continue working while I'm doing treatment, or I'm at a point now where I can only do 50% of my work, or would it be okay if I did this portion of my work and not that? So whatever gets you through it, there's no right and wrong. And if you absolutely feel you can't, that's your right too.
I think that's really helpful because young people, particularly, want to continue doing what makes them them.
Yeah.
And a lot of people would assume that they just, they have to stop work when going through treatment.
Absolutely not.
And it's the onus is on the employer to make that be able to happen. But what happens if you're balancing two different deliverables versus looking after that employee? Paul, can I turn to you?
Yeah, of course. And I say it's something that pops up a lot in the work I do when I'm working with leaders. So I can share with you, lots of leaders, when someone in their team is ill, they have a real personal, I want to help, but what goes through my mind is, I don't know how. I don't know what. What do I say? Do I say anything? Do I not say anything? So that's going on in the mind of the individuals at the employer and sometimes the organisation. If an organisation, as Genevieve was saying, if the organisation has a policy, then they can turn to that, and that's good. But they might not, or it might exist, but they don't know where it is. Yeah. So I think what's particularly helpful is drawing on what Genevieve has said a number of times, which is it's about communication. Yeah. So, and I think a starting point, which is that the employer has a positive intent for the person that's working for them, as well as continuing as an organisation. So if you're a business, could be drive revenue or profits, but it doesn't have to be. If you're a charity, it's to deliver outcomes for whatever the charity is set up for. And I think if the employee has a positive intent, which is I want to help the employer help me, those positive intents, if you're communicating properly, will come out in the conversation.
When we were talking about that, we talked about a disconnect between wanting to be that really compassionate employer, perhaps when the employee just wants to get on with it and be seen as productive. Yeah. How do you manage that one?
So I had this when I was working with a leader, and one of their team came back to the office having had cancer, and she's an amazing leader. I won't be mentioning her name because it's not fair or right. She's an amazing leader. And at first it wasn't going as she wanted it to. She said that it just doesn't feel right and the person in their team is not performing. So I shared a model that we use in coaching. It's very simplistic, but it's called the burger model. So if you imagine the shape of a burger, so you've got a bit across the top, a bit in the middle, and a bit at the bottom. And it's the middle relates to task, the top relates to process, and the bottom relates to relationship. Some people are drawn to one of those before the others in the workplace. So some people like to establish a relationship and then they become clear on that and then they work out what they need to do. Some people want to know what they need to do in each different order, and other people just want to know what they want to get done. So in this case, the leader was asking lots of questions about, how do you feel? Tell me about your treatment. Are you okay being back in the office? And it just wasn't landing well. So we talked about this model, and she said, I think this person is really task-driven. They just want to get back to work. They don't really want me to be looking after them too much. So she tried that for a couple of weeks, which is, here are the tasks. Any problems, let me know. And the nature in their relationship changed almost immediately. And 6 weeks later, that individual then did start to share some of the details about this is how I'm feeling, this is what it's like. But what they need, her reflection was, what that employee needed was to get back into the office and feel like they were adding value, not be treated like they would with kid gloves. Yeah.
As we've been saying, it's communication. Yeah. And I think in terms of everyone's individual, so it's about managing those expectations of almost having a bit of a traffic light system. I just want to be seen today. don't talk about cancer, lay down a red card. I just want to be seen as an employee. Now, I think the really important thing is, okay, so we've gone through cancer treatment, we've talked about that, and when it comes to work, okay, so the employer wants to return to work. Genevieve, what are they covered by? What act are they covered by?
So the Equalities Act of 2010 actually does cover you when you've had cancer. It's quite an impressive act in that it covers, cancer is a disability, or it's known as a disability, which I think a lot of people don't know. But it covers you while you're working and basically for the rest of your life in your employment. So even if you have had your treatment, you're okay, you're 20 years away from having had cancer, you can still be protected under the Equalities Act. I'd say this is the area that we get the most phone calls about. The most people are nervous about, what do I do going back to work? Particularly because a lot of people have been off for an extended stretch of time. It could be a year, 18 months, and all of a sudden they have to go back to work. They want to be productive, they want to add value. They don't want to often be seen as the person who's been off having cancer. And again, you know, a lot of organizations, I think the pitfall is that they haven't educated themselves enough as to what the employer either went through or what is expected of them as an employer. So I'd encourage all employers to actually know when your employee goes off with cancer, what is expected of me? How do I get them back into work? How do I get them to feel comfortable? So we call that reasonable adjustments. And reasonable adjustments are things that the employer can do in order to make it easier for the employee to come back to work. And again, there isn't kind of a set rule as to what it's got to be, but obviously it can't be too expensive. It mustn't be prohibitive for the employer. So for argument's sake, if you're a small butcher shop and the employee comes back and they need a lift, that's going to be prohibitive as far as cost is concerned. But anything like phased return to work, and I think a lot of people ask about that. They don't really know what it is. So phased return to work is your kind of starting steps to get back into work. That time that you take to kind of familiarize yourself with your job again, your duties, and also how you feel as a person going back to full-time employment. Again, have a look at the cancer policy. A lot of companies will typically have something in the range of between 4 and 12 weeks as a phased return to work. And I think you can't be rigid here because, again, everybody feels different. And I think if you've been off work for an extended period of time, getting up, getting out the door, getting onto public transport or getting in your car, you're exhausted by the time you get to work. So in your head, you're thinking, I'm going back to work 8 hours. I'm going to do exactly what my job title was before I left. The reality is you've got to work, you've had your first cup of coffee, you're exhausted, you're done. So be aware of that. Be aware of what the physical effects are going to be and have that discussion with your employer and kind of keep that open. Again, as the weeks kind of tick on, you might actually have brain fog, and that could last a year, or you don't suffer from brain fog, or you don't suffer from fatigue, or in fact, the fact that you're working 3 or 4 hours, you're so exhausted you can't concentrate on the task in front of you. So really have those conversations again. It seems like we keep saying that, but that really is important. But it allows you and the employer to kind of touch base, to say, okay, this is how I'm doing. And a lot of companies also get an occupational report, and that also tells you what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. Things like, for example, I got a mouse onto my left hand because I couldn't use my right hand after my operation. That's a reasonable adjustment. Asking your employer to get you a better chair maybe for your back, or changing your work position. So anything that would make your return to work more comfortable, you are entitled to ask for that. And if they're able to do that and it's not cost prohibitive, they should absolutely do that. That is their legal obligation.
Thank you very much. I think legal obligation is something that we will reiterate, and also the fact that cancer is a disability, so you are covered by the 2010 Equality Act for life. So that's really important for employers to know and employees. Temi, in terms of the stories that you hear about people returning to work, particularly in the age group that we're talking about tonight, I hear time and time again how important it is to get back to normal. That you know, but it's about finding a new normal. Do you find people are not very realistic in the expectations they put on themselves.
Yes, there is a lot of sort of high expectations that can be set. Again, just because of that desire to want to go back to normal, want to go back to what was familiar sort of before a diagnosis. And sometimes it's what I find actually with a lot of people, visitors that visit the centre, is that it's actually after their treatment that they have time to recognize what they've just been through and actually have maybe a bit more time to deal with that and manage that. And so actually going straight into work is something that they need to take a bit of time to decide and come to sort of big decisions about, because they haven't even maybe fully processed what they went through with treatment and things like that. So one of the things we do at Maggie's is we run a 6-week program specifically for patients who have finished treatment and are trying to just manage those sort of post-treatment challenges. A big one being sort of returning to work. How do I manage that? What sort of conversations do I need to prepare myself for? And we just try and really speak to them about that and prepare them for that. But it's really about taking time and not feeling the pressure to have to rush into it, and having conversations, you know, with, like we've been talking about, with your employers about where you're at, trying to have those conversations sort of fairly regularly as well, so that if and when things change, things can be adjusted accordingly as well. So not feeling that there's only one way that this can be
So from what I just heard, I think that maybe having a bit of a buffer period, so you thinking that I'm going to go back to work 3 months after I finish treatment, add a month, add 6 weeks, add a lot longer than that on
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, I often do tell people, this is the one time that you can be a little selfish, and be a little selfish, because that guilt about, I want to get back into work, I want to be doing everything that I did pre-cancer, it's almost a misnomer. You know, be a little bit selfish, because when you rush, I think what we often find is that people then do have exhaustion, do have fatigue, do have stress, and they then go off for that. And that return to work takes so much longer if they ever come back to work. So be a little selfish, take a little bit longer to get back into work, because then you'll be strong and vibrant and able to actually handle your work life. Have that balance. Be aware of what that is.
And I think, yes, of course.
So if you're one of those people, I'm sure we all know these, who find that really difficult. One way that lots of people is to reframe as to imagine someone you know or care about was trying to go back to work, and you imply the compassion that you would hold for them, but then you need to hold that up to yourself.
100%.
But it's really common that people go, no, I need to look after myself.
And then
immediately,
They
immediately go back to work and do a 10-hour day.
No, I think that's exactly it. And I think then you do find that relapse is even worse, because you've actually not healed. And then that kind of long-term illness then comes in. And that's a lot more traumatic on the person.
Nicola, was that, in terms of going back to work, do you think you might have gone a bit too soon, or do you think you went back to work?
Oh, no.
Talk us through that, if you're happy to.
No, well, I was in a really weird situation, because I'd only been at my employer for 4 months before I got diagnosed. So I'd just been seen by Ofsted and got taken on at an outstanding college, and it should have been like the prime point in my career. So I kind of, although my employer was really, really supportive, kind of my options were quite limited. So I really did push myself to go back, and they did say most people in my position would be off a year, if not 2 years. And I was back, I think it must have been about 6 months. And I definitely caused more damage to myself. Like, I have nerve damage now, and I use a wheelchair sometimes and crutches. And I think that's probably because I did way too much. So definitely I would take your time. I wish, in hindsight, kind of I'd struggled on and not worried about the finances, but that was definitely a massive driver for me. I wasn't kind of made aware of charities and how I could be supported. And like you say, I'm a young person with a mortgage, and that definitely pushed me into going back too soon. But I had lots of reasonable adjustments, I will say that, and my employer was really good. Kind of my plan was to go back full time, and then I started and was like, no, this is not for me. So we kind of did half days and things like that. And now I have access to work support, which I think is another fantastic thing that people have access to that actually not a lot of people know about. And I was really I pushed it away for a long time and struggled on trying to kind of be who I was before and do everything. But now I have a support worker, and that's been life changing. In all honesty, it just makes me feel so much better. So,
Well, thank you for being so honest and sharing your story. And it's wonderful to hear that they have been so supportive of you, and you've been able to get back to the thing you love in the college that is so wonderful. So congratulations on that job as well.
Thank you.
So, Paul, when you were returning to work, how was that for you?
So actually quite overwhelming. So when I returned to, just before I got cancer, I was doing 10-hour days, 5-6 days a week for months at a time. When I went back, I did 2 hours a day, twice a week. And Genevieve was talking about it earlier, so brain fog. Tammy was talking about the new normals. There were all sorts of bits of language that I then understood. I had to explain it to every different colleague again and again and again, and that became quite wearing.
Exhausting, right?
So, and lots of comments that my colleagues made were well-intentioned, but I remember someone saying to me, well, you've had cancer now, so you've got less chance of getting it than the rest of us. So I know what they were trying to say. With my most compassionate self, I was thinking, thanks for that. Not so much so. It was quite frustrating. And those comments do pop up. So for me, it was about, so how do I help myself in this environment? And it was taking it really slowly.
And how was your manager in supporting you to do that?
So actually really good for the first few years. So when I first went back to work, in effect, it was, we trust you, you tell us what you can do, where you can best add value, and we'll find a role around you. And that was amazing, really reassuring. That created in me a loyalty to make sure that I stayed at the organisation I was on probably longer than I might have done otherwise. And every day or week, I'd pitch up and think, how do I add more value than I'm taking out in salary? All as a result of how well was I treated while I was ill.
I mean, that's a real lesson to employers, isn't it? The more compassion and kindness you show to your employee who's gone through that, they will go above and beyond when in the limitations they have within that. Paul, you've been post-treatment for how long now?
Oh, how embarrassing. 2010 I was ill.
2010.
What year are we in? 2022. Look at me do some quick maths. 12 years.
When we were talking before, when we were preparing for this, you said to me that your fatigue levels went up and down.
Yeah.
That's something that a lot of employers might not realise. Can you talk us, if you don't mind, talking us a little bit through that?
So I started at 2 hours a day, twice a week, and then over the course of probably 18 months, I managed to get up to 5 days a week. And I remember at that point everyone saying, well, that's it, you're back, you're fine. And I could only operate like that for about 3 months before I needed to take about 3 weeks off. And then I thought, I'm not doing more than 4 days a week. 5 years after I'd been working 4 days a week, I then experienced another period of terrible fatigue, and I was off for another year.
Gosh.
So 5 years later, and I thought, all that's behind me, and it was a horrible year. But what was really interesting is the different experience I had 5 years later to that point, because I must have seen 12 different specialists, and I'm sure you'll have people watching this. And I don't know if you go and see doctor after specialist after helper, and they're just saying, no, everything's fine. You're fine. You just need to get on with it. That's just not helpful for where I was. But my employer at that point was, well, no, this isn't cancer. So, and that, I didn't know that I was covered by the Disabilities Act. I didn't know, and I was finding it really difficult to ask for help at that point, because I thought, well, no, surely I'm past this. This must be just me. But actually it wasn't.
No.
Do you hear that often, Temi? And
Yes,
Yeah.
you know, the sort of side effects post-treatment, depending on the types of treatment you had, can continue for long periods of time. And, you know, sometimes it takes your body a long time to sort of readjust to the sort of treatment. And so it can sort of be peaks. And I think it's really about sort of your body relearning yourself, relearning, you know, what's common, what's not, giving yourself the time to understand that and navigate that. One thing that I sort of always say to visitors is, you know, try and write something down, have a little notebook or journal, and see what's familiar, what things are happening regularly, whether that's, you know, every few months, and you're able to then go back and have a look and see, okay, this is occurring in this space of time, and it just allows you to have a bit more of an idea of, okay, what is common, what is not, especially when trying to sort of have those conversations with, you know, doctors and specialists. You've then got some sort of a record of, this is how long things have been going on, and this is how they occur and when they occur, and, you know, it, can just bring a bit of reassurance when you're going into those appointments and having those sort of conversations with employers as well as healthcare professionals as well.
Thank you. I think it's really important. Obviously, it's about communication, it's about keeping a note, but also this sense of phased return to work. So you've got your adjusted hours.
Yes.
So let's say you're going back doing 3 days a week, Genevieve, and you suddenly realise you're absolutely exhausted. And you actually, on your plan, it says you should be doing 3, and you can't do tomorrow. You just can't. Do you just not turn up?
Well, I mean, I guess if you want to have that trust relationship with your employer, be open and honest. And I think, you know, kind of touching on your post-chemo or post-treatment side effects, for a lot of people it does take longer. And I think employers do underestimate when an employee comes back to work. They think, well, hang on, you're back. Treatment's behind you, you're fine, just get on with it.
You look fine.
Exactly, you look fine. Oh, you're looking so healthy. Well, I feel absolutely awful today. I mean, chemo, it is not unusual to have chemo brain for a year. It's also not unusual to suffer effects of chemo up to 5 years. And depending what your treatment is depending how able you are to go back to work. The more treatments you have, so operation, chemo, radiotherapy, the harder it is for your body to actually heal and also for you to achieve what you want in your workplace instantly. So be aware of that as an employer and as an employee, and allow yourself that time. So,
So these reasonable adjusted hours, could I say, okay, I've said I could do 4.
Absolutely.
But actually I can't.
Yeah,
Can I go back? Can I go forward? Can I go back again?
Again, it just comes down to that communication. And I think, unfortunately for employers, I think as you mentioned, sometimes we don't know how to assist the employee. We don't know what to say or how to best help them. And of course, you can't help until the person is actually saying to you, I can or can't do this. So I think having that structure there and saying, well, we're going to aim for this. But let me know how you're doing. So if, for example, you wake up and you just can't go to work, you know, feel comfortable and confident that you can pick up the phone and say, it can't happen today. Or I can only do 2 hours today. Or I'm going to stay at home, but I'll see you tomorrow. You know, they need to be flexible. And that is what a reasonable adjustment is, isn't it? Being flexible around a person's return to work and how to best support them. But you can only do that when you've got an open and honest relationship.
I wonder if it's I've seen this lots in the workplace where it's, well, I've got a schedule. I always meet schedules.
Deviate.
I always meet schedules. I've done 3 weeks at 3 days. Next week is a 4, so I'm going to do it. And sadly, that's the time when we should learn to listen to our bodies and say, I'm not sure this is right.
But also, is it about having the conversation in advance? So, okay, we said by April the 1st that we would, that you want to be doing 4 days a week. Let's have a catch up 2 weeks before that happens. So it's about expectations of the employee and the employer. So as we keep saying, it's communication. In the words of Tony Blair, communication. So I want to quickly turn to, what if the employer is awful? What if the person returns to work and they no longer have a position, or there's been a restructure?
Gosh, this does happen a lot.
Or there's someone who's covered their job and, oh, they did such a good job, we haven't really got space for you anymore.
Yeah.
Does that happen, Genevieve?
No, it happens a lot. And again, I think it's employers that don't really know what their rights and duties the employee has. So first of all, if that does happen, if you come back to your job and someone else is taking your job, that's discrimination.
Okay.
Because you'd be treated less favorably on the basis that you've had cancer. So you're now being treated differently to everyone else in the organization because you've had cancer. So that is discrimination. First and foremost, when you're going back into the workplace, there are structures. Employment law is quite a nice framework. It is really almost codified in that there are certain duties and certain things that an employer has to adhere to. So if you feel harassed or bullied or there's a grievance, you don't feel comfortable in your workplace, there are certain procedures that you can follow. So in that circumstance, you would first of all speak to your line manager or HR department. If that's not getting you any joy, go and see what the next kind of person up the chain is. If that's not getting you any joy, there's always a grievance procedure. You are entitled to actually say, I'm not happy with this, and write a letter and say why you're not happy. And they have the duty to investigate that. And so there are rights, there are obligations that the employer has. Nobody should go back to work and feel that they're being victimized or bullied or harassed or verbally abused. It's not on. No. And if you do feel that way, please do seek advice. Don't kind of suffer in silence. There are lots of organizations out there working with cancer, Macmillan again, I think Maggie's, there are lots of people that you can go to and get advice. Do not suffer in silence.
So they should also keep your job open for you when you return?
Yeah, absolutely.
And if there has been a restructure, which can happen,
it can happen.
A job should be kept open for you in a certain role? Or?
I mean, it's a little tricky when it comes to redundancies. That's a whole kettle of fish. Again, it's a misnomer that somebody that's had cancer can't be made redundant. That's not true.
Wow.
If the employer has good reasons for redundancy, for argument's sake, they experiencing financial issues and they do need to cut the workforce. If they can show that based on all the criteria that they've looked at, that you are still selected for redundancy and it is not based on you having cancer, you can still be made redundant. Gosh. So unfortunately, just having cancer is not going to protect you from that. Okay. However, a proper procedure has to be followed. If, for argument's sake, they have made you redundant and you feel that maybe it is based on the fact that you've not been in office because you've had cancer, again, that's discrimination.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got that clear now. Nicola, do you mind telling us a little bit about what happened to your mum?
No. Yeah, I think for me, when I was going through my journey, that was probably the biggest thing kind of going in my head, because when I was younger, I was 13, my mum had kidney cancer at 35. And I just remember her kind of going through everything and then losing her job. I won't say who she worked for, but it was someone that I wouldn't have ever kind of put two and two together and said that that would happen. And it crushed my mum. I think she lost kind of her identity. And, as kind of young children, we were really, really aware that, we'd go out and do another paper round just to kind of help out at home. And it shouldn't have to be like that. And definitely that was a huge thing kind of playing on my mind. And I think my mum's anxieties definitely were kind of put onto me surrounding my job, because that's what we'd seen. So it was a really terrifying time.
And it's so wonderful that your experience was different to your mum's, and it must have been really scary to not know what your employer was going to be like. With your mum, was it a case of she had good conversations with her employer, or did it happen very suddenly?
No, I think it happened over a period of time, and I think a lot of kind of our stories reflected, because I think I kind of saw it as she didn't get well quick enough.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things where I think it was kind of like a restructuring, and she just didn't seem to get better. And I think yeah, it was definitely kind of that it felt like she didn't get better quick enough, and then when she was better, there was no longer a place for her. And I think, still today that impacts on my mum. She's not as confident, and she doesn't put herself out there as much. And I think because she lost a job that she truly really loved.
Yeah.
Um,
It
and
shows the importance of having those conversations, and things hopefully have changed so much since that time, but not enough, right, Genevieve?
I think that's right. I think unfortunately there are horror stories out there.
There's a horrible irony to this, in that during or after your treatment, that's sometimes when we're at our lowest, where we're at our least resilient. And I suppose it can be helpful for lots of people that when you're least resilient is the time that it's good to ask for help. So in that same self-compassionate way, also if your best friend was going through this, think about what you would say to them to help them. How might they get extra support? That's the time to really ask for it. So.
And we've also talked about the physical fatigue, but also the mental toll of going through cancer and the psychological impact compounds everything else.
Yeah.
Confidence, as we just said, confidence get affected because a lot of your identity is wrapped up. Let's be honest. We spend more time at work than anywhere else. In terms of getting a new job, so interview, applying for a job. Can we talk through that in terms of, do you have to declare it?
No, you don't have to declare it at all. And often we'll give advice that you don't declare it. I mean, again, it is personal. You can declare it if you want. Obviously, if they do know and they don't offer you the job based on the fact that you had cancer or have cancer, that could be discrimination. But you don't have a duty to tell a future employer until you have the job offer. So once you have the job offer, it's sealed and signed, then, you can say that you've got cancer. Again, it's that conversation, isn't it? If your new employer doesn't know that you've had cancer, and again, private and confidential to you, but if you suddenly do have fatigue or you do need a reasonable adjustment, they're going to be going, well, why are you asking for a new chair? What's that all about? Take time to think about what you need in the workplace and how you want to communicate that to the employer.
So obviously at interview you don't need to declare it. When you accept the position, you still don't need to declare it. But when you get to chat to your line manager, it's a good thing to have that conversation of what your needs are, but you don't have to go into details of your diagnosis.
And a lot of people don't want to talk about cancer. It may be happened, maybe this is a fresh start, maybe they don't want the employer to know at all. Maybe they feel if they start a new job, nobody knows. I can just be myself. I'm not somebody sitting in a cubicle, that poor girl that went through cancer, or that poor guy that, look at him, he's just come back. I wonder how he's feeling. Maybe they just don't want that. And so there's no obligation for you to do that.
Is there anything anyone wants to add? I think we've definitely covered working with cancer. Is there anything, Nicola?
I think just be kind to yourself. Don't underestimate what you're going through. Don't think, oh, it's only me, I'm crazy, oh, I should be feeling better. Actually, you don't sometimes. Actually, you do feel pretty rubbish. I felt terrible for the first year. Brain fog's a real thing. It is a real thing.
Talking about brain fog, I think it's an employer only knows what they know. They don't know what they don't know.
Absolutely.
So explaining these things, explaining what brain fog is, explaining what fatigue is. Because we talked earlier about the fact that an employer might not understand what fatigue feels like and how it plays out. You might say you could be in the workplace, but you might not be able to actually perform at your best. And it's better to almost have less time in the office when you can perform and then cope with go home and then return when you can perform better.
And just on a legal basis, it's to be honest with your line manager or your your employer. It is really important because a lot of people get performance-based bonuses, or their annual reviews are based on performance. So if you're not open and honest about, actually, I can't perform at 80% or 90%, when it gets to the end of the year and you get the bad performance, you can't turn around and say, but hang on, I couldn't perform. So be honest, have that chat. And if you want it to be confidential, let it be. But be honest.
I think we've talked a lot about what the rights of people who have gone through cancer,
Yep.
but when it comes to the employer,
Yep.
I want to be able to arm them with everything to be able
Yep.
to support that person in the best way possible. So you've talked about the cancer policy. Where could they find a copy so you could get a template?
Right. Cancer policies, I mean, a lot of human resources websites, unfortunately, a lot of them are paid for websites.
Okay.
But they should have a cancer policy. Your HR department should be able to draft a cancer policy. Maybe just searching something up, just saying cancer policy, getting a framework of what you want in there. It really is just a guideline as to what do I do once my employer comes to me and says, I've got cancer. What do I do? How do I support my managers, maybe?
Yes.
What does my manager do? Do they go to HR? Who do they notify? Do they go to payroll? It's just giving that guidance. And then
So important,
the
isn't it?
do's and don'ts, I think, are really important. Don't harass the employee, but do ask meaningful questions.
I mean, that's a brilliant way of saying it, isn't it? I think it's. And what about in terms of a kind of template for a phased return? Like, what can an employer expect from someone who's returning?
Okay,
Because how do I know that?
Yeah.
How do I know what I can cope with? I've only just getting my head around that I've had cancer. Like, I don't know if I could do 3 days or 3 hours or 3
Yeah,
minutes.
maybe, Paul, did
Paul?
you have a phased return?
Yeah, so I had a phased return conversation, but I'll be really honest. It was a, what do you think is a good
Yeah,
phased return?
that's exactly
and then,
right.
And then, well, it was good, but at the time I thought, I don't know.
Yeah.
So for the first half an hour, I was saying, so what's a good phased return? Well, what do you think is a good phased return? Well, I'm asking you that. Well, I'm asking you that, and it wasn't. But we came to the conclusion, okay, so start gently and see what happens.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking 2 hours a day, that's ridiculous. And then at the end of my first 2 hours, I was exhausted and I had brain fog and
Yeah.
slightly disappointed when you said brain fog for 5 years, because I'm 12 years old and I'm still
got it.
brain fog.
I'm not sure if that's...
Not brain, it's I'm kind of getting older, slightly forgetful.
Everyone's individual, Paul.
Everyone is an individual, yeah.
Again, it might be an organizational policy that's out there that gives a kind of framework for what they determine is a reasonable period for the adjustment. As I say, somewhere around about 4 to 12 weeks. But get that occupational health report that often gives the guidance as to what the person can do, how long they should be phased in for. That gives a lot of guidance to the employer. So I think if you can get one of those reports, definitely do ask for that. Even a doctor's report, going to your GP or your oncologist or your surgeon, they should be able to say, look, I don't think you'll be able to go back to work anyway for the first 6 weeks. Getting that kind of guideline is very helpful, because you're right, you go back to work, you don't know how you're going to feel day to day, or how long should I be taking to get back into work?
I was also conscious that I didn't want to say, I'll tell you what, I'll come back and I'll take on a big project.
Yep.
And then have to drop it, because I knew that would cause my employer difficulties. So, and in the same way, working with people who are leading people at having phased returns, lots of employers will be saying, oh, well, let's not give you too much.
Too much, yeah.
It's better to do one job well than 3 jobs and you feel the stress. So it's more predictable. It can be frustrating and difficult if you're in an environment where you're, as a team, being asked for more. So 10% growth at the same time, you've got staff. So there is an unfortunate balance of being a leader that you're responsible for both sides.
Also, in terms of you were the person who smashed the targets before cancer,
Yeah.
how do you deal with the emotion of no longer being that person?
It's hard. It is hard. I think that expectation, isn't it, for yourself, that maybe you're not quite where you used to be.
Yeah.
So again, allowing, like you keep saying, allowing yourself, just be kind. What would you say to your colleague? I think that's really good advice, because I think, especially in your 20s and your 30s, you're at the kind of pinnacle, you're starting your career, or you're really getting going in your career, you're trying to hit targets, you're trying to get up that ladder, and all of a sudden you kind of knock back, and you want to still be there. And you will get there, maybe differently. Maybe this is actually a different job you're going to do. So be aware of that. You might not always go back to that job. You might have to do something slightly different. Maybe you think, I don't need this stress.
So
So
reframing.
it's being aware of what you need.
The differently is really powerful. I drove the success I had in my career in my 20s and very early 30s for a bit till I was ill through being in the office first,
Yeah.
leaving last, and working longer hours than everyone. But everyone then said, "Oh, Paul's always got loads of time." And after, if you can only do 2 hours a day, what drove my success wasn't available to me.
Yeah.
So I then had to, and it took a long time to then think through. So if that can't drive success, what else can? And you hit that really nicely, which is it might be something else.
Yeah.
And the career I do now is far more personally rewarding.
Yeah.
I loved what I did before, but I'm more comfortable with what
Yeah.
I do now. I really like it.
And to be honest, we do hear that a lot. It's kind of people going back. That is actually a question I get asked a lot. But what if I don't want to do the hours? Or what if I don't want to do that job role anymore? And I think allow yourself to have that thought.
I think it's magic. I think they're the best questions.
I
Do
mean,
I have to do it?
do I have
No,
to
you
go
don't.
back?
No, you don't.
You don't.
No, I mean, a lot of people say, find the job. It's a shock to the system having cancer, and it's shocked me out of, actually, I hated that job in the first
Yeah,
place.
absolutely.
What else is out there? But it's that confidence to do that, isn't it? When that identity was in that job, and then cancer's taken that from you, the idea that, I've got transferable skills is a hard one to kind of, so it's about rebuilding yourself, and I think that's a beautiful transition into coaching, Paul.
Ooh.
So let's talk coaching. So how could when it comes to work and coping with returning to work, how could coaching help them?
So typically, it's helping someone work out for themselves all the questions that we've addressed. So sometimes it's challenges, sometimes it's opportunities. So if you're struggling with, my team are treating me differently, working with a coach would be, okay, so how do you want them to treat you differently? What's within your control that might influence those behaviors? It could be, do you know what, I don't think I want to do this job anymore. And a coach will, without judgment, with curious, say, okay, so what is it that you've done well that you've enjoyed in the past? What could you explore? The coach won't give you advice. The coach won't tell you what to do. They help you think through it for yourself.
Is coaching for everybody?
So it's strange, being a coach, I'm going to say, actually, no. I'm really nervous of anything that says one solution is the be-all and end-all. I know that coaching doesn't work when someone gets sent for coaching. It can be powerful to anyone that wants a different way of thinking through something, be it an opportunity or a challenge. A sad aspect, though, is that it's not available to everyone that does want it.
Yeah.
That would be something I'd love to be different.
Yeah.
I think I would too. I think there are coaching's definitely becoming something that's beginning to be offered in lots of different workplaces as well.
Yeah.
I think to sum up, it's so important to know your rights.
Yep.
To know that you're covered by the Equality Act 2010 for life. Make sure that communication, keep the communication channels open from both you and your employer.
Yeah.
And if you don't know, equip yourself with the answers and talk to other people who have had cancer and to hear their own experiences. And also to say to employers, it's not about shaming you guys, it's about helping you to ensure that your employees can have the best and they can do the best work that they can possibly do within their own remit and limitations that they can cope with, and ensure that you manage them in a way that's compassionate and also is beneficial to the employer. So thank you so much. Do we have any questions from the floor? Oh. We've got quite a few. Thank you, Bryony. Oh, some really good questions here. Okay, Temi, how would you explain the gap in employment on your CV at an interview?
Yeah, I think like Genevieve was saying, you don't have to state that, it's been cancer or that you've been going through treatment. Some people will actually try and still do training and things that they can do online, even though they're on that break from work. So still trying to show that, you know, they've been doing things to continue their skills. If you feel comfortable sharing and placing it on a CV or a personal statement, then you can. And it might be that there's things that you've actually learned in that process that you can add to your CV and say, actually, during this time, this is what I have gained, this is what I have learned. So almost turning it around and not just seeing it as a negative, but looking at what you've been able to sort of achieve in that gap, and using it to your advantage. So I would say,
I mean, nothing's wasted, is it?
Exactly.
We're always learning through experiences. Anything you'd like to add? Anyone?
No, that's great advice.
Yeah. Nicola?
That's really good.
No. I think we've touched on this, but I think, how often do I need to check in with work whilst on long-term sick? We talked about keeping in touch days, but there aren't. That's maternity.
That's maternity.
So you don't have those, and they're not paid.
Again, it's so personal, isn't it? A lot of people want that kind of contact with work. I've had some people that say work has called me every week, my line manager has called me, or whoever the person is that you're in contact with at your employer. They'll phone every week and say, how are you doing? Is there anything that we can do? Some people don't want that. A lot of people really just want the privacy to get on with the treatment. They don't really want to engage with work, and that's absolutely okay too.
Head down, get on with it.
Absolutely. So again, I've come back to this, but it is that let your employer know how you want to be treated.
Yeah.
And if you don't know, kind of say, well, would it be okay if I start my treatments and see how we go? Maybe give me a call, but if I don't want to talk, please understand that I'm busy going through treatment.
Yeah.
Kind of take it as it comes, I think.
Fantastic.
Can I
advice.
add to that?
Yes.
It can be really helpful for an employer to have some advanced warning.
Yep.
So if you think about planning of teams or projects, if it's possible for you, you can say, it would be great in a month, rather than phoning your boss on a Friday and saying,
Yeah, no,
at
absolutely.
9 on a
Of
Monday,
course.
sort me something out.
Yeah.
And it's funny because we're in our world, but that positive intent towards, I know they want to help me and I want to help them, I think that can help.
That's really, really helpful. I think the fact that you're all singing from the same hymn sheet and on the same team.
Yeah.
I mean,
and do if you know what your treatment plan is going to be, I think this goes down to what you'll be able to cope with.
Yeah.
Share that treatment plan. I'm going to be doing chemo for X amount of time, or I'm going to be having chemo on Tuesday. I'll probably be off for the rest of the week, but I'll be back on Monday if I feel better. Have that conversation.
yeah. And as we keep saying, each cancer experience is different.
So
and
different.
each people respond to treatment differently. So,
Yeah.
so keep knowing what is right for you is not always right for other people. So this is an interesting question. A lot of jobs say, do you consider yourself disabled?
Yeah. I've seen that coming up a lot at the moment, particularly with kind of when you're applying for jobs online. There is a questionnaire that you fill in prior to actually applying for the job. It's a really interesting one. Again, I think you can say yes or no, dependent. If it's pre-job, there's no requirement for you to say that you are disabled. It's a tricky one.
A lot of people don't like to call
Correct.
themselves disabled.
Exactly, and particularly with a cancer diagnosis, a lot of people don't even know they are determined disabled for employment law. So I think it's okay for you to say no, and then once you've got the job, say, actually, I didn't want to mention it there, but maybe there are some adjustments that I do require.
Yeah. This is an interesting one. How realistic is it to ask for reasonable adjustments and work towards a promotion at the same time?
Very. Again, case by case. If you think, each person's kind of journey through their work life is so different, isn't it? So if you are trying to go for promotion, it will depend on what that promotion has been geared up. Is it hours per work? Is it clients that you bring in? What is the criteria that you need to reach in order to get that promotion? Again, having that conversation. I am trying to go for that promotion, but I'm getting back into work. So these are the things that I can do in order to fulfill the criteria needed for the promotion. Very often it might be that the employer says, well, we will look at you for promotion, because remember, you can't be discriminated against.
Yes.
You know, they can't say, well, you can't go for promotion
'Cause you've
because
just come
you've
back
had
from-
cancer
yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
you've just come back from cancer. That would be discrimination. But maybe talk about how you get there.
Yeah.
So absolutely go for promotion. Just because you've had cancer or coming back from cancer doesn't mean to say that you can't go for it. Maybe how you structure it, how you get there, that might be different.
Also, I think putting that weight on yourself when you've just come back from a cancer diagnosis, say, I really wanted to do that promotion before my cancer diagnosis,
Yeah.
I'm just going to get back on it, seems quite a lot to me.
Yes, it is. It is just that high expectation. And it might be that actually there's something that you can do that isn't quite that. That is the first goal or even the second goal when you say, okay, I'm going to try and work towards this over a period of time and actually just break it up a little bit so it doesn't feel like you're just working towards the final big goal, but that actually there's 3 steps before that you really want to get to. And I think it's just remembering how far you've come at each of those stages as well, and going, actually, yeah, this is what I achieved and I got here. So that can motivate you to get to the next step. But I think it's really important to pace yourself.
Pace yourself, yeah. What are my rights to ask my employer to return to a different role but at the same pay?
Ooh. Okay, so that starts to get a little tricky. So there's a...
I really appreciate that. Ooh.
Ooh. No, 'cause it's quite a loaded question.
It is, isn't it?
I've got a
I'm
few
glad
of
you're
these.
there.
I've
Oh,
got a few
wow.
of
Okay. Right. So the simplest way of saying it is, in a period of reasonable adjustment, you can do a role which is not identical to the role you are contracted to do, and you can still be paid for that. However, if you decide that you're going for a new role or something different that maybe has a different job title, different job responsibilities, there can be a drop in wages. And so your employer is not required to pay you at the same wages if you're having a different job role. Again, that's agreed between the parties, and that is a change of your contractual terms.
Okay.
So there may be a drop in wages or in your remuneration package. There isn't a guarantee that you can just say, well, I want another role because I can't cope with the one that I had, but I want the same. I mean, your employer might go for it. It's worth asking. But no,
If you're a
it's
valued
not.
member of the team, then you know it's in terms of that, isn't it? It's about having those conversations.
Yeah. So if your job role changes and your contract of employment changes, your remuneration may or may not change. Again, it's organisation specific, I think.
So let's hope for the best.
Yeah.
On that one. Let's hope for the best on that one. Good luck with that one. So thinking about a phased return, I think we've talked about this. Is there a minimum of hours that can be expected by the employer?
No. Again, I mean, we are so individual. You know, sometimes people actually, I know a lady who was a teacher actually, and her phased return, she was coming back from quite severe cancer. And she was a year 1 teacher, and she wasn't able to actually do the duties of a year 1 teacher. So her phased return was actually her going into school and reading up policies, or her just getting to school and maybe just being in the classroom. There is no minimum. It's whatever you can cope with, whatever is reasonable for you, having that discussion with your employer.
So that's hard for the employer to manage. But
is.
it's also about working out together, because you're all on this journey together, aren't you? Your employer and employee
And remember,
are learning all the
it's
time.
job specific, isn't it? What you're required to do. You know, don't go back to a job if you don't actually think you can do it. So, for example, if you're a tube train driver, for argument's sake, and you don't think that you can handle driving in the tube, it's an extreme example, I'm sorry, but if you don't think you can actually do the job that you're contracted to do, don't. Rather stay off, get well.
Yeah.
So it really is job dependent.
I think that takes us on to, if I'd returned and realised it's too much, what are my options? We've talked about you can go forward, back.
Absolutely.
Fine. Oh, gosh. I've been told I need to use my annual leave to be able to do a phased return.
I've got a comment. But I'm just going to clarify that I'm not a lawyer.
I was like...
But here's a deep, deep question, and it comes from a position. I'm just going to clarify of privilege. which is, do you want to work for an employer that
Yeah.
asks that of you?
Yeah.
But with that, just to clarify, that is assuming that you don't need to work in order to pay the bills that are there immediately. So that comes from but what's deeper within that is, if you've been through a difficult environment, part of a great role is believing in the organisation that you will treat them and they'll treat you well. And if someone was asking that of me, that's the question I would ask myself.
Are you saying you'd shove the job if you could?
Well, that's a different way of putting it. I'd ask myself, how much do I want to work?
How much do I want
How
the
much
role?
do I really want this? Is the role really worth it?
So obviously, if you had a financial cushion
Yeah.
and you, as you say, from a place of privilege, can they do this?
Yeah, so no. That's the short answer. A lot of companies, what they do is when you're having your phased return, often you would, because your annual leave accrues while you are off on sick leave. So that's important to know. It doesn't just stop, it continues to accrue and you take it when you come back. A lot of people will phase return maybe for 8 weeks and then decide, but actually they would like to stay on 4 days a week and be off on that 5th day. Then you can use your annual leave, because then that covers you then as far as your wage is concerned. But being asked to take that as your phased return, no.
No, the answer to that question is no. Okay. During my phased return, I then feel I'm not ready to be at work.
Yep.
Can I leave and extend my absence? I am a teacher and due to have a meeting next week.
Okay, I don't want to give individual advice
Nope.
without actually knowing the specifics of the matter. Just kind of a broad advice is, if you don't think that you're capable to continue with your duties, particularly as a teacher, because it's a very demanding job, both physically and emotionally, have that conversation again. If you feel that you've come back to work and you just can't cope, remember they need to find cover as well. So be honest and open and clear about it. It's a very stressful job. So, a lot of teachers don't go back to teaching
Nicola?
just based on stress alone. So if you're coming back from cancer and you feel, actually, I'm not equipped to do this, have that conversation. Don't just leave, speak to your head, speak to HR, discuss, maybe I can actually be back at work 1 day a week and we need cover for the rest.
So difficult, isn't it?
It is really difficult.
Dealing, the employer dealing with it, covering all of that,
Yeah.
all the money as well. I think it's really important to recognise that there are each individual case, and there needs to be different,
100%,
different
yeah.
conversations. But one of the things I wanted to quickly ask is, what can you do if you can't do the job that you did before? Do you have to go beyond the reasonable adjustments? Because if the job cannot, does that make sense? If the job
absolutely.
cannot provide.
No, I know exactly what you're saying. Okay, very often it does happen. There are so many variations of cancer out there, and treatment options are so very different, isn't it? Sometimes people do have operations that, for example, you do lose a limb, or you do lose a part of your body that you may be needed in order to be able to do that job. That falls under another realm. That is then medical incapacity. So if you're unable to actually fulfill the role that you are contracted to do, that would become a medical incapacity procedure that you will then follow. Again, it will be occupational health reports, it will be doctor's reports, and you will then be dismissed on a medical incapacity ground. However, you could also say, I just don't want this, and resign.
Okay.
You could do that too.
I think, is there any other questions? Anything else that you want to ask? I think we've covered everything.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Temi. Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Just to let you know a couple of things coming up. We've got Meet and Paddle, which is in London on the 9th of April. And we also have an event in Manchester, we're just confirming the date at the moment. That will be in May. And we also have other Lifting the Lid events coming up as well. So it's been fantastic to have you join us this evening. Thank you so much. Good night. You can clap.
We can't clap, can we? Okay.